If you ask most people what their number one fear is, what do you think it is?
Do you think that the public will perceive you any differently after all that's been in the news about you?
Are you anti-Semitic?
Most people's number one fear is public humiliation. Okay, so that's almost 4 years ago, dude. I mean, I've moved on. I guess you haven't. I don't give a anymore. I'm not afraid of it. Let's move on, dude. Come on. Because I've had plenty.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Mel. Take care.
Bye-bye. Asshole.
The lead up to the Passion of the Christ is one of the most fascinating and controversial stories in all of Hollywood. And the man at the head of it all is one of the most fascinating people in all of Hollywood. This guy.
Ladies and gentlemen, please say hello to Mel Gibson.
People what these men did here.
To be or not to be, that is the question.
I'm not a violent man.
It's good to finally meet your friends.
Shall we not revenge?
Give me back my stuff!
Mel Gibson created the most successful independent film of all time when he wrote and directed The Passion of the Christ. It's grossed over $612 million worldwide, which is astonishing considering the challenges that came with bringing this movie to life. The project was shrouded in controversy from day one. There was talk about excessive violence, accusations of anti-Semitism, which called for many people to boycott the movie altogether before it was even released. Hollywood wanted nothing to do with it, and yet, despite all the adversity it faced, The Passion of the Christ was released and saw massive success. It paid off in the end, but why go through so much trouble to get this film made? Because before this, Mel Gibson starred in a string of successful movies dating back to the 70s, up until the point of wanting to make The Passion of the Christ. So why? Why would Gibson try to make a movie that no Hollywood studio wanted to be associated with and put his own career in jeopardy? To answer that, we'll need to go back to the very beginning. Mel Gibson was born in Peekskill, New York, and moved to Australia at the age of 12. His ties to Australia come from the fact that his great-grandfather moved from Ireland to Australia in the 1800s in order to escape the Great Famine. For those not familiar with the Great Famine in Ireland, it's a time period in which mass starvation wreaked havoc throughout Ireland that started with the infection of potato crops. The death toll was estimated to be about 1 million people, and between 1845 and 1855, 2 million Irish fled the island nation to North America, Britain, and Australia. At the time, about 80% of the entire Irish population was Roman Catholic. This was due to missionaries who helped spread Catholicism throughout Ireland. The most famous missionary, of course, being St. Patrick. If you've ever celebrated St. Patrick's Day and have no idea who he is and just thought it was a day to drink green beer and pinch people, well, now you know. Needless to say, Ireland has strong Catholic roots, and this was the basis for Mel Gibson's family upbringing. His father is an interesting figure in this story because he's part of the backlash that was aimed at The Passion of the Christ before its release due to some controversial views. Mel Gibson's father was Hutton Gibson, a writer who was part of a traditional Catholic movement considered schismatic by the Catholic Church known as sedevacantism. The root word sedevacantism comes from the Latin phrase sede vacante, which means the chair being vacant. In this context, it means the chair that belongs to the Pope. Sedevacantists hold the view that there hasn't been a valid Pope since 1958.
In 1958, I was 2 years old, right? And there was a very funny thing that happened in the conclave. You know, usually there's white and black smoke that goes out of the chimneys to tell you, we have a Pope, you know, habemus papam, you know. And the white smoke came out. And everybody cheered and they went crazy. And then about a half an hour later, black smoke came out. That never in history has that happened.
Without getting too much into church history, this movement started because these traditional Catholics reject the Council of Vatican II that took place in the early 1960s.
It isn't what it purports to be anymore. It's moved away from what it was intended to be and what it is. And it's running an entirely different religion. I actually don't adhere to a post-conciliar church.
You see, Vatican II made major changes to the Catholic Church in an effort to connect with the more modern world. Sedevacantists are vehemently against these changes, and in the case of Hutton Gibson, he believed Vatican II was a plot to destroy the Catholic Church from within. Keep that in the back of your mind for now, because Hutton Gibson's views are relevant to this story, very relevant, and I'll share more about his beliefs later. For now, just know he was a huge influential figure in his son's life, to the point where, according to Mel Gibson's childhood friends, Mel Gibson lived in his father's shadow and felt like he always needed to live up to him. Think of Mel Gibson as Simba, if Simba had a DUI, something I'll touch on later in this video. And Hutton Gibson as Mufasa, if Mufasa had sent Simba to a Catholic high school, because that's exactly what happened to Mel Gibson when he attended St. Leo's in New South Wales, where Mel Gibson was actually picked on for his American accent. I found that interesting because in his old interviews, he sounds pretty Australian to me, so obviously he picked up this accent and carried it well into his adult life. Not only that, but he had some pretty strong views on Australian politics.
And then they have something called foreign aid, which is, it'd be okay if it was feeding starving children or something, but it's not. They're giving many millions to countries like Red China, North Vietnam, South Korea, to develop steel industries. And they give this money to them interest-free. But you know who has to pay the interest on that money? The Australian taxpayer has to pay the interest on that money.
The bullying that Gibson experienced led him to become rebellious in his teenage years, and he ended up getting in a lot of trouble because of it. There was fighting, smoking, drinking, insubordination, just to name a few acts of defiance. All normal stuff for a lot of teenagers, but you can start to see how this shapes who Mel Gibson is, and it has a lasting effect on him that starts to creep up here and there in his adult life. Especially the drinking, because this wasn't just random drinking at parties. It was heavy drinking that would continue for decades, and it's an essential part of the lead up to the Passion of the Christ. Gibson studied and fell in love with acting at the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney, Australia. It wasn't too long before he got his big break, really by accident. Gibson was able to land an audition for the action film Mad Max, a movie that would end up becoming a franchise and turn Mel Gibson into a star. The story goes that Gibson actually showed up to the audition bruised and battered.
I was a mess. I mean, my eyes were shut, jaw knocked off the hinge, nose broken, everything. I was like, 28 pounds of hamburger meat. It was just not a nice sight, and they were staring at me in horror.
I'd been in a pub fight with a rugby team, and of course, you're fighting like three guys, they beat the hell out of you. So,
honest to God, you weren't?
Yeah, I got into a fist fight, and I ended up the worse for wear. And I drove a buddy of mine to an audition.
A guy named Stephen Bisley for a film called Mad Max. I drove him to the audition, and I was sitting in the waiting room, and the girls in the waiting room said,
What the hell happened to you? And I gave them a brief explanation. I was a little embarrassed about it. They said, let's take a few Polaroids. So I'm like, being an extrovert, not really, but they took a few snaps of me.
They tacked it up on the board and they said, hey, we need freaks for this movie. Come in about 3 weeks and we'll see. After you heal up, we'll see. And I go, okay.
So I came back in 3 weeks, and they said, yes. And I said, I'm here. And they said, well, who are you? And I said, I'm that guy on the board. And they said, oh, interesting. Go in and talk to the man.
I went in, he said, tell me a joke. I told him a joke. And he said, okay, can you drive? I said, yeah. So I got the part.
This story adds to the defiant demeanor that Mel Gibson has, a demeanor that was actually necessary in going through with the making of the Passion of the Christ, despite all the pushback that it got. After Mad Max, Mel Gibson goes on to have a lot of box office success. We'd see him in everything from action films like Lethal Weapon to voicing John Smith in Disney's adaptation of Pocahontas to romantic comedies like What Women Want. Gibson loved acting, whether it was on film or on stage, but he didn't limit himself. In fact, in 1989, Mel Gibson founded an independent film production company known today as Icon Productions. This production company became the saving grace for the Passion of the Christ, But over a decade before that, in 1993, Mel Gibson made his debut as a director in The Man Without a Face. 2 years later, we see Gibson in a movie that, if you've only seen one Mel Gibson movie, it's this one. Mel Gibson directed, starred in, and helped produce the movie Braveheart, which went on to win 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and, more importantly, Best Director.
And the Oscar for Best Picture is presented to...
I had a dream. It was really weird.
Braveheart.
And it was really weird because I had an assistant at the time called, his name was Dean, and he'd been with me a couple of years. He was an incredible guy. He's funny. And I woke up one day and he came into the room and he said, I had a dream last night. I said, so did I. It was the weirdest dream ever. We were in pre-production. I said, I dreamed we were wearing tuxedos and crying. And he said, he nearly had a heart attack on the spot. He had the same dream. It was really strange.
And what does this say to you?
It says that
There's some psychic thing out there that works?
there's more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy, Horatio. It's like, it's just one of those things. I mean, I have no problem believing in the supernatural world and all that encompasses, you know. So I just kind of said, oh, that's interesting. And neither one of us said the O word because we didn't want to jinx it, but
Yeah.
we just say, same dream.
Tuxedos, but you didn't say statue or anything like that.
No, we were in tuxedos
Yeah.
and we were crying.
He had all the Hollywood clout he needed to be greenlit for just about any project he saw fit. Any project except The Passion of the Christ. More on that in a bit. From the outside, everything looks like it's going great in Mel Gibson's life in the early 90s. But while everything in his career was going right, everything in his personal life was going left because Mel Gibson had a huge problem, a huge drinking problem. And according to him, it's something he'd struggled with since he was just 13 years old. It was a coping mechanism for the bullying he went through that I mentioned earlier. And in 1991, he starts attending AA meetings after his wife and agent pleaded with him to get help because Mel Gibson was in a dark, dark place. And when someone's in a dark place, Hollywood isn't exactly the best place to be in. Gibson's always had a strange relationship with fame and Hollywood. He seems to distrust it, like something is off.
I mean, this is a bizarre place. And it doesn't take very long, and I'm sure you've experienced this if you've stayed here for any length of time. It's an odd place. You know, I had a whole bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand.
Right.
And nobody was really bothering to explain it to me. And you imagine all these horror stories there that you think, surely that couldn't be. And then you realize that it is true. And no matter how strong you are, when you come in, you are going to be affected by this place. And you have to, I just left for a while and then you go away and you think, no, I was wrong. I mean, that's insane thinking. I'm paranoid. I imagined that stuff. That couldn't be the reason for why so-and-so was acting like, could it? And then you find out later on the track that you were exactly on track. That some of your worst nightmares were real.
Despite his gripes with Hollywood, he managed to maintain a few close relationships in the industry.
The truth is, he and I have a friendship that spans well over 2 decades, and he's a stand-up guy. He always has been for me. And certainly when I was not hireable, he put his ass on the line, and I couldn't get insured, and he said, I'll take that chance.
Ultimately, Hollywood, fame, and alcohol took their toll, and Gibson admittedly got to the point where he no longer wanted to live, but wasn't ready to end things either. He described it as a desperate, horrible place to be, and part of this is what eventually led to him making The Passion of the Christ. This wasn't a movie he decided to make all of a sudden. In reality, Gibson had always wanted to make a movie depicting the life of Jesus since the early 90s, when his life seemed to be falling apart. He admitted at the time that he was going through a faith crisis, and he drifted away from it. And in an attempt to reconcile with the beliefs he grew up with, he started to picture the Gospels in a very realistic way. And so he recreated them in his mind to make sense of them.
I just kept having visions about it, you know, and about, what was that like 12 hours like?
And that is what he wanted to bring to the big screen. He wanted to take the images he formed in his mind about the Gospels and turn them into a film. But there were Problems. Problem number one, accusations of anti-Semitism. The amount of criticism The Passion of the Christ got from the Jewish community would have been enough to tank just about any project. So what exactly started all this criticism? I recently watched it to see if I could pick up on any anti-Jewish tropes or dialogue, but the truth is, I didn't see anything. And the film seems to be pretty close to what's found in the Gospels. So what happened? Well, the reality is, the criticism started before the film was ever released. The script to the movie was leaked and it started to make its way among Jewish circles. And there was fear that the film would stir up negative emotions toward the Jewish community.
Abraham Foxman, head of the Anti-Defamation League, who slipped in uninvited and watched the movie among Christian evangelicals.
I was very troubled. I was disturbed. I believe that this movie has the potential to fuel anti-Semitism, to reinforce it.
But was that an overreaction or was it warranted? In the film, the Pharisees, who were the Jewish leaders at the time, were the antagonists of the film, along with the Roman soldiers who tortured and ultimately crucified Christ. But I think it's important to note that the protagonists were also Jewish, namely Jesus Christ himself, and the apostles, and Mary, who was played by a Jewish actress, Maya Morgenstern, who happens to be the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
She says her father read through the script with her.
We found the script beautifully, very poetic, and very philosophical.
It's possible that if you're Jewish, you might be seeing this movie through a different lens, but I think it's safe to say that any ill will towards the Pharisees wasn't the main focus of the movie, and it's not the main focus of the Gospels.
So who killed Jesus Christ?
The big answer is, we all did.
Do you believe this is an anti-Semitic movie?
No, I do not believe it's an anti-Semitic movie.
So if the film itself is not anti-Jewish, then what exactly is this criticism rooted in? Well, the answer is complicated, to say the least. First, we have to keep in mind that Christianity and Judaism have a long and strained history that includes a lot of conflict throughout the Middle Ages. This includes bloodshed during that time period that left this everlasting tension between the Jewish people and certain sectors of Christianity, including the Roman Catholic Church. But all that changed in the 1960s. There was something I wanted you to keep in the back of your mind that I touched on earlier in the video. I mentioned an event that took place in the 60s called Vatican II. This was an ecumenical council that made major changes to the Catholic Church, and one of these changes was a declaration by the name of Nostra Aetate, which is Latin for "in our times." The principal aim of Nostra Aetate was to address the Church's relationship with non-Christian religions, and Section 4 of the Declaration deals specifically with Judaism, and it states, furthermore, in her rejection of every persecution against any man, the Church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecution, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time by anyone. This is a pretty strong declaration from the Roman Catholic Church and its stance against anti-Semitism. Nostra Aetate was just one of the many changes that took place at Vatican II. But all these changes are part of what spurned the Sedevacantist movement I touched on earlier, and that brings us back to Hutton Gibson. I mentioned earlier he believed Vatican II was a plot to destroy the Catholic Church from within, but what I didn't tell you is that Hutton Gibson believed this plot was backed by Masonic Jews. And yes, Hutton Gibson's views were not only brought up, they were one of the key issues in the backlash against Mel Gibson's movie.
And Mel Gibson repeatedly says that his father has never told him a lie.
However, Mel Gibson made it very clear that he didn't share his father's views.
I think people wondered if your father's views were your views on this.
Their whole agenda here, my detractors, is to drive a wedge between me and my father.
But also made it clear that he wasn't going to badmouth his father or let anyone drive a wedge between them.
He's my father. Gotta leave it alone, Diane. Gotta leave it alone.
Now, as much of a stir as the accusations of anti-Semitism caused, they weren't the only point of controversy that plagued The Passion of the Christ before it got released. The other uphill battle Mel Gibson was facing was the violence depicted in the film. Some of the critics thought the violence was extreme, and some even went as far as to say that it looked like a horror film. Time magazine even listed it as one of the most ridiculously violent films of all time. I'll be honest, there is a lot of violence. Some of the scenes are bloody, they're long, and they can be hard to watch for some people, but I personally didn't think it was gratuitous, and obviously, neither did Mel Gibson. In his view, yeah, the violence is uncomfortable, but it's necessary in order to capture the vision that he had for the Passion, the way he visualized the Gospels. The violence is in its proper context, and Gibson thinks that if he had filmed exactly what happened, the movie wouldn't have been able to have been made because no one would be able to see it.
Did you ever think it was too much?
Of course it was too much. I wanted it to be shocking. And I also wanted it to be extreme. I mean, if it was easy, it isn't worth much. I wanted it to push the viewer over the edge. And believe me, I did a lot of research on it. And according to all the research, it was way worse than that, anything I showed you. And it does that. I think it pushes one over the edge. So, you know, it was worthwhile.
I think the violence makes the movie more personal and gives the scenes a level of emotion that I don't think most people would normally get from watching something violent. So in that sense, it wasn't done in vain. Roger Ebert, who was a famous movie critic, wrote on his website, "This is the most violent movie I've ever seen." Despite that, he gave the movie 4 out of 4 stars. In the movie, we see Roman soldiers striking Jesus, placing a crown of thorns on his head, causing him to bleed profusely, and then whipping the flesh from his body. And this doesn't even include the actual crucifixion. So what does all of this violence mean as far as the film goes? Well, it means that The Passion of the Christ was due for an R rating from the Motion Picture Association of America. And an R rating means the audience gets limited, which means less revenue, which means this project just got even riskier. For the re-release, Gibson did make an effort to recut and re-edit the movie to take out some of the more brutal scenes because he was really hoping to get a PG-13 rating. It didn't work, and when the movie got re-released in March of 2005, it was still too violent for anything less than an R rating, even though Gibson had cut out 5 minutes of the movie that included the most graphic scenes. So how did a movie with so much negative press make it to the big screen? Because not only was the movie shrouded in controversy, the movie wasn't even in English. It's in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin with English subtitles. It was a giant risk, and Mel Gibson was going to have to be the one to take that risk, meaning he was going to film and finance the movie. And it was going to be through his production company, Icon Productions. The budget, $30 million and another $15 million in marketing, all on Mel Gibson's dime. So there's a story, there's a vision, and there's a budget. All Mel Gibson has to do is make all three things work together. For those that haven't seen it, The Passion of the Christ covers the last 12 hours of Jesus' life, including the suffering and crucifixion. This is what's referred to as the Passion. The movie was shot in Italy, with the majority of it being filmed in Rome. The actor who played Jesus of Nazareth, Jim Caviezel. Caviezel, like Gibson, also grew up a devout Catholic, and when he found out he had the chance to play the part of Jesus in a Mel Gibson-directed film, he jumped at the opportunity, even though Mel Gibson told him this role could end up costing him his career. Despite the warning, Jim Caviezel proudly took the role and never regretted it, even though the actual filming took a tremendous toll on him physically. There were days where he filmed with one eye open, which led to constant headaches. He dislocated his shoulder during the scene where he's carrying the cross. He battled hyperthermia, a lung infection, and pneumonia. But the wildest story is that he was reportedly struck by lightning while on set.
It's been rumored, I don't know how true this is, that as you were filming this, you were hit with lightning?
Yes.
That's true.
I was lit up like a Christmas tree. It was a shot I was doing on the Sermon on the Mount, and I knew it was going to hit me about 4 seconds before it happened. I said, I'm going to get hit. And when it happened, I saw the extras grab the ground in front of me.
Jim? Oh, he suffered up there. He really suffered. I mean, it was freezing out there. He was up on this thing. His arm was like, he had trouble with a bad shoulder. It was all ripped out. And he never complained much.
All worth it to him because Caviezel believed in the movie and he believed it needed to be made. Also, for what it's worth, he defended Mel Gibson against the anti-Semitism accusations and said if he thought that this film was in any way anti-Semitic, he wouldn't have participated in it. Maya Morgenstern, the Jewish actress I mentioned earlier, also shared the same sentiment as Jim Caviezel. But none of that really helped to secure studio funding, and even though Mel Gibson financed the film, he still needed a distribution company so the film could be shown to audiences. The only problem was, just like no production company wanted to be attached to the project, neither did any major distributors. Gibson was actually under contract with 20th Century Fox, and they had a good relationship with his production company, Icon Productions. But at the end of the day, with all the controversy and threats of boycotts, 20th Century Fox passed and wanted absolutely nothing to do with The Passion of the Christ. Mel Gibson was stuck. That was until a privately owned film company came into the picture. That company was Newmarket Films, and they had previously distributed a few movies like Monster, which won Charlize Theron an Academy Award for Best Actress, and the cult classic Donnie Darko. Suddenly, everything is back on track. Now that Gibson had distribution, it was time to market the movie. A religious movie with subtitles, with no A-listers, threats of boycott that no Hollywood studio wanted to touch. Walk in the park, right? Well, actually, yeah. You see, Gibson didn't need the studios. Turns out, there was a built-in audience for this movie, and as long as it wasn't seen as blasphemous the way movies like The Last Temptation of Christ was seen, Gibson could rely on the greatest marketing technique of all time. Good old-fashioned word of mouth. And that's exactly what he got. Gibson got a ton of support from Christian communities to help promote the movie. He teamed up with a Christian media agency, Faith Highway, which helped him produce commercials for individual churches across the US using clips from the film. The United States Methodist Church and Seventh-day Adventists thought The Passion of the Christ would be a good tool to evangelize people, so many showed up to the movie showings with booths outside to answer questions for people. Gibson also reached out to the evangelical community, who were more than enthusiastic about the film when he screened it for over 800 pastors.
Well, I love you folks. You know, about 12 years ago when I was when I made this film, I was literally getting the tar kicked out of me. Mm-hmm. And it was you people out there, evangelicals, who stood up and supported me. And I thanked you at the time, but I thank you again, okay? So that was great of you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. We love it.
It got support from some of the biggest names like Billy Graham, who said the movie brought him to tears. Graham said the film was faithful to biblical teachings and that it made him feel like he was actually there. That was a huge, ringing endorsement from one of the most influential Christian figures at the time. Speaking of influential Christian figures, what about the Pope? What did he have to say about the movie? In 2004, the Pope was John Paul II, and he reportedly watched a private screening of The Passion of the Christ before it was released. His official verdict? Well, it's complicated. Apparently, after viewing the film, he said, "It is as it was." A positive statement alluding to the idea that he felt the story was accurate according to the Gospels. But then suddenly word came out of the Vatican that the Pope actually never said that. In fact, the Vatican said the Pope had no official opinion on the movie. There seems to be this view that because John Paul II had been working on relationships between the Roman Catholic Church and Judaism, that an endorsement of a film that had anti-Semitic allegations could sour the relationships he was trying so hard to mend.
The first 3 years that he was the Pope, he went to 3 synagogues. You know, he's basically tried in his way to show everyone that he feels that the Jewish people are very important. He sees this as a fundamental part.
The Vatican also said that even though the Pope watched the film, he doesn't give opinions on art.
Apparently, he said it is as it was. And then apparently he didn't. And then apparently he did again. And then, went back and forth. I don't know.
So, no official endorsement from the Pope, but there was still enough buzz for a promising opening. And that promise would hold true. The Passion of the Christ was released on Ash Wednesday, February 25th, 2004, and on its very first day, it grossed $26 million. Up until recently, it was the highest grossing rated R movie of all time. It's pretty amazing considering everything it was up against and the fact it was banned in some countries due to the fact it contradicts Islamic teachings. For those that are unaware, Muslims see Jesus as a prophet and not as the Son of God, the way he is in Christianity. In Israel, the movie wasn't banned, it just wasn't released in theaters for the reasons I mentioned earlier. A lot of this was balanced out by countries like the Philippines, which is mostly Christian. And in any event, Mel Gibson's goal from the start was to tell the story about the Passion, and he managed to do it, even with everything working against him. By the time it made its way to people's homes, 20th Century Fox had realized the massive mistake they made and the money they missed out on by not being part of theatrical distribution. But they decided to at least be part of the Passion of the Christ for VHS and DVD. Getting a piece of physical copy distribution was still great business in the early 2000s before streaming services became the de facto viewing method for movie watchers. So even though they made some money from home distribution, I'm sure 20th Century Fox was kicking themselves for not getting in on the theatrical release where moviegoers got to experience the last 12 hours of Jesus' life. The opening shot shows the agony of Gethsemane, where Jesus is shown praying, and shortly after it depicts his betrayal from the apostle Judas in what's known as the Kiss of Judas. This leads to his arrest. The movie then shows Caiaphas, who was the Jewish high priest, holding trial where he ultimately decides in favor of killing Jesus due to what he perceived as blasphemy. The portrayal of Caiaphas is part of what started some of the allegations. He's clearly the main antagonist in the movie and turns Jesus over to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate because it was against the law for them to kill Jesus, so Caiaphas has the Romans do it for them. Pontius Pilate feels nervous about condemning Jesus to his death, but does it anyway at the request of the crowd, who had the choice of freeing Jesus or freeing the criminal named Barabbas. After this scene, the movie gets violent. The film moves into what's known as the scourging at the pillar, where Jesus is beaten bloody with weapons that tear into his flesh, and this is all on screen. After the flogging, Jesus is presented in front of the crowd wearing a crown of thorns that was placed on his head, and the crowd calls for his crucifixion. The cross that was used in the movie actually had a fair amount of weight, and that was by design. Gibson wanted this scene to feel authentic, so instead of using something of light material, he decided to go with a cross that was heavy enough that Jim Caviezel ended up having his shoulder dislocated from carrying it. We see more violence that earned the movie an R rating when we get to the crucifixion and see the nails being driven through the hands of Jesus, and again when blood is seen leaving his side after it's pierced from a spear of a Roman soldier. Being on the cross was one of the more physically challenging scenes for Caviezel.
It was so cold. It was like knives coming through you. Hypothermia. I don't know if you've ever dealt with that. One day of hypothermia, you're so cold I couldn't barely get the lines out. My mouth was shaking uncontrollably. My arms and legs went numb. I was suffocating on that cross.
After the crucifixion scene, Jesus is taken off the cross and put in a tomb, and the film closes out with his resurrection. The movie is done, and it is a raving success.
So again, do you feel like king of the world at that point, that you got through it, or do you feel like you survived, or where are you?
I just survived it. I was like bleeding by the time we released it, and there was so much outcry and stuff. It was like crazy. People putting guilt trips on you and stuff, and it was, it got released, and then it was like crickets.
After The Passion of the Christ, Gibson had another successful endeavor when he produced and directed the 2006 film Apocalypto. Also a historical piece, also a movie in a foreign language, and also financed by Mel Gibson. A movie that had a $40 million budget and took in $120.7 million at the box office. Quentin Tarantino said it was a masterpiece. Martin Scorsese and Spike Lee also gave it high praise. It seemed Mel Gibson had the respect of his Hollywood peers as far as being a filmmaker. There was just one tiny problem.
Thursday night, Mel Gibson was arrested on the Pacific Coast Highway with a bottle of tequila in his brand new Lexus, and he was clocked at about 84 miles an hour in a 45 mile an hour zone. We're now finding out today that he not only leveled some what can only be conceived as or perceived as anti-Semitic comments to the officer.
These are the words.
How horrible does he think they were? I read to him the officer's account of the words he used that night. Expletive Jews. And to Officer Me, are you a Jew?
Are those anti-Semitic words?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Sounds horrible. And I'm ashamed of that. That came out of my mouth.
He became uncooperative, profane, threatening.
A few drinks later, and I was in the back of a police car wailing, so...
A few drinks later, do you know how many?
No, I don't. But I know it was tequila.
At times, violent, banging himself against the car, inside the car.
How long had you been drinking again?
A couple months.
Tried to escape.
He says he has also realized he had been harboring an old resentment.
And the other place it may have come from is, as you know, a couple of years ago, I released the film The Passion. Now, even before anyone saw a frame of film, for an entire year, I was subjected to a pretty brutal sort of public beating. I thought I dealt with that stuff, all forgiveness, but the human heart's a funny thing. Sometimes you can bear the scars of resentment.
Is there hate in your heart? Is there anger in your heart?
There was anger from that, I think, because I felt that I was unjustly treated.
And then there was 2010, where Gibson was recorded making threats and screaming racial epithets at his then girlfriend. Later, he would plead no contest to a misdemeanor battery charge. Mel Gibson had been officially blacklisted from Hollywood.
That's the price you pay, because sometimes it's what you need.
It looked like Mel Gibson's career was officially over, and he was set to be an obscure former star who fell from grace. That wasn't until an old friend came to his defense.
Actually, I asked Mel to present this award to me for a reason, because when I couldn't get sober, he told me not to give up hope, and he urged me to find my faith. Didn't have to be his or anyone else's as long as it was rooted in forgiveness. And I couldn't get hired, so he cast me in the lead of a movie that was actually developed for him, and he kept a roof over my head, and he kept food on the table. All he asked in return was that someday I help the next guy in some small way. It's reasonable to assume that at the time he didn't imagine the next guy would be him. Or that someday was tonight. So anyway, on this special occasion, I humbly ask that you join me, unless you are completely without sin, in which case you picked the wrong industry, in forgiving my friend his trespasses, offering him the same clean slate you have me, and allowing him to continue his great and ongoing contribution to our collective art without shame. He's hugged the cactus long enough.
Mel Gibson was back, a resurrection, if you will, of a once dead career. Speaking of resurrections.
Now, you've got another film coming up, I hear, but it probably haven't started yet, called The Resurrection. It's a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Is that true?
Yeah, sooner now, because what I had to, it is such a massive undertaking.
Because we don't want to just do a simple rendering of it.
I have 2 scripts, right? And one of them is very structured and a very strong script, and kind of more what you'd expect, and the other is like an acid trip.
Wow, so you would actually do a little Inferno?
I'm not sure, but it's worth thinking about, isn't it? Get your imagination going, right?
He's been on this for a long, long time.
Is Jim going to come back as Jesus?
Yeah, of course.
It will be the biggest film in history.